Hi, hi everyone. I need some kind of like annoying YouTuber intro that are like now my name is like flat is like a 3D image and it's like flashing. It's like Dr. Joe, Dr. Joe. But I don't have that. So welcome to my video makeup tutorial. My name is Joe Cadigan. As I say in the syllabus, please just refer to me as Joe or Dr. Joe. I actually kind of like, I have a family that I'm friends with in Kentucky, and they have three little Southern boys who used to call me Mr. Joe. And then I got my doctorate, leveled up, and I insisted they called me Mr. Dr. Joe. It's got a slash in it. So you could even call me Mr. Dr. Joe. But I'm just a recent PhD from Stanford. I am now a postdoc fellow here at U of T at the Jackman Humanities Institute, where I'm ostensibly working on a podcast, actually, and I just got my new mic for Christmas. So let me know if you think it sounds good or if it's popping. And the podcast will be on works of contemporary opera, which is what I'm a specialist in, especially strange, weird works. The first one I'm working on is by a Canadian composer. I'm an American, and so as an honor of my hosts, I wanted to do a Canadian composer, R. Murray Schafer, who died recently. But he had this crazy 11-hour all-night opera based on ancient Egyptian mythology, and you follow the underworld, the Egyptian Book of the Dead and mummification, and you meet the different gods and things like that. It's an interactive opera. So I'll be sure to let you guys know when that is up, hopefully very soon by the summer. This class. Oh, I should also mention that my PhD is in musicology, which I'll discuss a little bit what a musicology is later, but it's about the musical equivalent of what art history is to art. So focused more on the composers themselves, the cultures that they lived in, the time periods that they lived in, and how their music interacts with these different cultural aspects. I'm also a music journalist, which is how I came to this fellowship here, which is a new media public humanities fellowship. So I work as an opera critic, mostly focusing on CDs and DVDs of new contemporary works. And I'm writing reviews of that. And if you look up my name, you can find all my journalism and learn about some weird new operas. Actually, this class, even though that is my specialty, this course will be focused on the first half of the 20th century, which is now, some of these works are over 100 years old. I've decided to, as I say in the announcement and in the syllabus, it's easier to hone in this class rather than do the entire 20th century, which the first half is very different from the second half. And also to limit the types of genres we're looking at. So I specialize in opera, but I'm also branching out into the world of ballet, and some of my favorite works and some of the most important works of this century in European music, European art music, come from ballet and are part of the orchestral repertoire, even though they may not be performed live as ballet is with choreography. They'll do just the music alone in orchestral concerts. So if you were looking for a class on Rent and Wicked and what's the other, Hamilton, which are all wonderful works, and I'm not denigrating them at all, I'm afraid this isn't the class for you. We will be looking at some early works that are actually prototypes to the American musical, more like Broadway reviews, that a bunch of little connected numbers that are a bunch of little popular numbers that are barely connected by a plot. But there was a fascinating work called Shuffle Along that we'll be looking at, which is one of the big first hits of the American Broadway musical. And then the other work we'll be looking at is Porgy and Bess, which is sometimes by George Gershwin, sometimes performed as a musical, but was conceived as an opera. And we'll be looking at the influence of early American musicals on opera. But that one class period will, unfortunately, for some of you, be the extent of what we look at in musical theater. But I just want to let you know that a better title for my a version of this class as the since the it's purposely left open, so visiting professors like me can or normal professors at U of T can tailor it to fit their interests. So my tailored version might be called Modernist Opera and Ballet from the early 20th century. So this is pre-World War II. And I should also add as a caveat that these are American and European works. So that term modernist will be crucial for our understanding, and I'd like to pick it apart for our discussion today. Well, one-sided discussion, our lecture today. I promise you that we will get to music for the 11 subsequent classes that we'll be meeting together for. But in this first lecture, you need to bear with me as I give a lengthy historical lesson about the word modernism and the different conceptions or even misconceptions surrounding that word. Some of you have never even considered it, and it's crucial to understanding the works, the repertoire in this course. So today will be a more of an old-fashioned sit and listen kind of class. Actually, for the most of it, you can actually just listen if you want to. I know some of you, if I'm a big podcaster, I'm supposed to be one. So I think, and I may actually upload an alternative version that's just the audio, no video. So there will be a few little paintings at the end that I'll put up on the video version, but I'll be describing those in detail. So you could actually go back and look at the paintings later, or not at all. And so if you want to just sit and listen while you work out, or try not to catch Omicron in your basement apartment, then you can do that as well. But I promise that future lectures, especially our in-class ones where I can see your little faces and see your responses or your snoring, hear your snores, will be more interactive and have a more audio and visual components that we'll be looking at. I'll also add that oh, no, I already explained that. Also, please look at the syllabus. I don't want to be that professor that reads through every single line of it. Over the course of the lecture, I'll discuss some of it, but please go through it to get a sense of this class, my expectations, and the scope of the class, and also how much or actually how little work this class really is. I've done that purposefully just because this is such I've talked to other professors who are interacting with students more than I have here, and just how burnt out you guys are. So I want this to be fun, you guys. No, I want this to be your enjoyable class, where if you get an extra hour during the week, oh, I'll sit down and actually listen to the work that Joe said I should listen to. Like I said, say in the syllabus, there are no required readings, but there are recommended readings that'll be no more than 30 pages. I think I said 10 pages, that was a lie. The only required thing, of course I can't enforce it, is just to listen to whatever the work is that we're looking at outside of class. And I'll even cut off certain sections and have you listen to only excerpts, so you're not listening to a 3-hour opera, which I tried to listen to. I re-listened to something recently and I was getting a little bored, and I thought, oh god, I can't have students who are new to opera sitting down for 3 hours. That being said, you're welcome to listen to the full 3-hour works if it's a 3-hour work on your own. Some of you may find that fascinating. I would recommend breaking it up into different sections, but what I'm trying to say here is that the one requirement is to have fun and just to get to know the works on your own. And then, as I mentioned in the syllabus, there'll be 2 in-class tests. I'll mention more about those later. They'll just be identifying clips from works, and putting the name of the composer and his or her dates, maybe the name of other people involved, the choreographer, the librettist, the person who writes the libretto, little book in Italian, the text for an opera, and also they sometimes refer to the scenario of the ballet. Obviously, there's no text in ballets. There are some ballets with text. We'll get there, but the libretto is the scenario, the plot that's being depicted through the choreography. Why did I bring up libretto? Oh, mentioning the person who wrote the libretto, the librettist, in the test. and also defining terms like libretto and librettist. And you will get a whole list of all the terms. There won't be a lot of them. And I don't want long answers. Your TAs don't want to read 2 paragraphs about what a librettist is, since they already know what a librettist is. So it'll be short little answers. The thing is just to show I'm showing up. I know what's going on. So that those 2 tests in class, there won't be during finals week. And then the final project, which I'll get to at the end of this project, at the end of this lecture, which I think it will be really, really fun for you guys, especially if you have a hobby. I hope you guys have a hobby. God, I hope it's not like Xbox, even though I love video games. I hope you have a productive hobby that you can engage in, even if it's doing little dances on TikTok, little, you point to the words. I don't know how TikTok works. So that'll be your chance to explore to utilize your skills that you may already have. All right, let's get started. So today, the title of today's lecture is What Was Modernism? The use of the word was in this question might seem a little bit paradoxical for you. In the colloquial sense, modern means the current and contemporary, the life and culture and events as they exist now, or at least relatively recently. So how can the word modern exist in the past tense? Shouldn't the question be, what is modernism? You might also have not thought about the little ism at the end, the -ism, or its adjective offshoot, modernist, -ist. What do we mean when we add those 3 little letters? What's the difference between calling something modern and modernist? It gets even more confusing when we change the ending to other three letter suffixes like modernity, ity, or modernize, ize. How do those fit into the mix? Before we answer that, either what was modern or what is modernism, it might be helpful for us to figure out when the time period we call modern is. Again, it seems a silly question. The modern is now, as I mentioned. If you're alive and kicking and aware of your surroundings, you're modern. But that word comes to English via French from the Latin word modernus, which is derived from the Latin root modo, M-O-D-O, which means recently or just now or presently. The term modus is the origin of the French word mode, which means fashion. Hence Edna Mode in The Incredibles, who's a fashion designer. Or you might have heard the phrase a la mode. At a restaurant, you won't get a catalog of Vogue. If you ask for something a la mode, you'll get ice cream. It means within the scope of dessert, a la mode means with ice cream. But more typically in French culture, in the French language, a la mode means in the style or in style. Or in fashion. So the idea of fashion might seem like a good metaphor for the temporal concept of modern, something that is always changing and quickly fades into the past to be replaced by the new and the novel. Yet that leaves us with a rather strange paradox, that there are periods of time that were modern, though I suppose that's just the paradox of time itself, that the present is continuously slipping away into the past. But this does create a sometimes humorous experience of retrospection when we delve into the past and find people referring to something as modern in the past. Here's a clip from the 2003 BBC film Eroica, which depicts the first rehearsal of Beethoven's Symphony No. 3, or the Eroica Symphony, in the year 1805.
I thought you lot were supposed to be good.
It's off the beat, sir.
And there's so many markings we can hardly read them.
Gentlemen, it is our first attempt. Patience, please. Even to my ears, it does sound rather fiendish. Rather difficult to play, don't you think?
Violent. Needlessly violent.
I've marked it exactly as I want it played. The marking here, you see, sforzando.
Sforzando.
A sharp attack to each note, Your Highness. I'm really hammering it.
How modern.
Listen to the orchestra struggle with the opening measures and their objections to Beethoven's instrumental writing. The music likely sounds perfectly normal to you in the present day. It's exciting, it's heroic, hence Eroica, the title. It's robust, but in no way would you refer to it as needlessly violent, as one listener does. The reaction of Beethoven's patroness is, at the end of this clip, is a bit of comic relief. But it also helps us listen to this piece with fresh ears, to imagine a time when Beethoven was considered a new and modern. It's also a sobering reminder that the kind of art we consider novel and new will look charmingly old-fashioned to our descendants. Our fashion metaphor might be helpful in helping us to understand the word modern, not so much as a fixed point in time, but as a process or a state of change. What's in style one moment will be out of style the next. That's fashion, baby. No, but over longer periods of time, we can track a continual flux of updating and newness that might be termed modernity or modernizing. Indeed, there are spans of time in history of rapid change that provoke a particularly pronounced sense of a before time or old world and the now time or new world. When history proceeds from more or less unimpeded with relative stability of culture, politics, and technology, there's less of a difference between the then and the now, which would spark a sense of living in a modern time, if we could view that change. Much of distant history, at least from our distantly removed present point of view, seems to lay dormant in this state of inertia, interrupted by big events that transform everything very quickly and typically very violently. We can point to comparatively brief spans of time that are marked by rapid changes and that amplified this sense of being in a modern time versus an old time. It has nothing to do with time itself, of course, but the experience of more than usual change within the individual's lifetime over the course of just a few generations, so that the change is more noticeable and dramatic to those who are living, including those who recorded history. One of the most significant periods of modernization in European history took place around the year 1500. In the year 1517, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but his namesake from half a millennium earlier, Martin Luther who was a German monk, nailed his 95 theses, not feces with an F, but with a TH, his 95 theses on a church door in Wittenberg. This was a list of complaints against the corruptions of the Catholic Church that he was witnessing, and a call for a reform from within the church. He was opposed to the unchecked power of the clergy and the abuses toward the peasantry, who were being extorted and were unable to participate in church services or even understand the Bible, which was read in Latin rather than in the vernacular languages spoken by the common people, French and German. So Martin Luther's list of complaints set off an irreparable schism within the Catholic Church, with the Protestant Church, which Protestant coming from the word protest, the Protestant Church breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. It also set off a peasant uprising that was quashed through horribly violent means. Europe became a crucible of very fast social, economic, and intellectual change during this period, but these were changes that had already been developing over the previous centuries. Europe had been an agrarian and feudal society previously. A lord would oversee a fiefdom, or an area of land that included farmland, a village, and a castle. Peasants on the farmland owed their allegiance to this lord and were little better than slaves. They owed all their food and production to the family in charge. But there was a shift toward an urban and a capitalist society, which was further catalyzed by Luther's empowering of the peasants with his Reformation. Luther spearheaded a huge shift in power by emancipating peasants from the yoke of feudalism and the church, and encouraging them to encourage their access to education and to the gospel. A new economic system emerged, with skilled workers and craftsmen earning money for themselves from their own labor, rather than farming for the church or for a feudal lord. Commerce centered in villages and towns rather than in the countryside. And Luther's, we'll also discuss how this, when we get to modernism, we'll discuss the repercussions of this new system, but you can imagine what a change at the time, what an improvement it was for the lives of the everyday people of the peasantry. So Luther's questioning of papal authority also coincided with a cultural and intellectual transformation that had already been occurring during the century before he posted his 95 Theses, a period we now call the Renaissance. Thinkers like Galileo, Leonardo, Copernicus. You want to know, this is another pretentious moment. Don't call Leonardo da Vinci. His family was from a town called Vinci. It means from Vinci. That's, always refer to Leonardo as his first name, Leonardo. I'll have these little pretentious moments to help you speak like a true humanities scholar or humanities asshole. So thinkers like Galileo, Leonardo, Copernicus, and Kepler questioned the official church doctrines on science, which often and were often persecuted for doing so. But they paved the way for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, an age when knowledge was accumulated through observation, reason, and logic, rather than predetermined by religion and superstition. Also during the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of classical art and literature. By classical, I mean ancient Greco-Roman art and literature that had been prohibited by the church. In visual art, techniques were rediscovered for more accurately depicting how we perceive the world around us. Perspective techniques as a more faithful representation of space, and the study of anatomy to better represent the human form. Hence all those muscle men, like David, the statue of David. So another big change during this period around 1500, just 25 years after Luther's Theses, 25 years before Luther's Theses, the European world would be totally shaken by the discovery of a new world across the Atlantic. This would have been akin to discovering life on a new planet today. It was the pinnacle of the age of exploration as Europe set off ships both eastward and westward. A huge wealth of knowledge about the earth and its peoples, their cultures, their religions, and languages. In some sense, this destabilized Europe's sense of centrality, of being the center of the world. But unfortunately, Europe soon sought to bring the rest of the world under its control and reestablish this centrality. This was the beginnings of imperial expansion, the scramble to colonize, which laid the work for the subjugation and enslavement of non-European peoples to feed our exploding economy and our taste for novelty. This period of rapid change around 1500 ushered in several centuries of continuous change, though marked by the emergence of certain unifying ideas that we mostly maintain today in Western society. Things like liberalism, humanism, the sovereign nation state, the scientific method, secularism, the separation of church and state, etc. Historians have marked this point at around 1500, where so much change took place so quickly, as the beginning of the modern age of Europe, as distinct from the pre-modern age of medieval Europe and Greco-Roman antiquity. Of course, all historical divisions are arbitrary, and this common division into modern and pre-modern ignores many of the advances made during the supposedly dark ages of the Middle Ages. That's a topic for a class on historiography. At any rate, the popular division of European history, by the measure of this more popular division of European history, we continue to live in the modern age. But those who lived and died since around 1500 also lived during the modern age. In fact, we break this period down further into the rather silly sounding early modern period from around 1500 to 1800, and the late modern period from about 1800 to today. But the word modern in this case isn't the popular colloquial sense of now. It's acting more as a title for these periods. There's a sense of a shared history of being moderns that we in the colloquial modern day of I have 2021, 2022, you can see when I wrote this, have more in common with the people who existed in the centuries after 1500 than we do with those who lived before, in the Middle Ages and the classical period. In some cases, this is true, though the more you read history, the more you realize that change is only the surface of things and that we fundamentally remain the same as humans. At any rate, we apply this term modern over a large period of time, most of which obviously isn't literally modern, as in 2021 or even 2022. But it's undeniable that we share the same experience of rapid and intensifying modernization with these so-called early moderns. There's a sense of a shared nowness over the past half millennium, that even though our modern isn't exactly the same as Martin Luther's modern, we share in this process of change and the culture that arose in response to that change. So, to review, the way the word modern is used in European history to label the modern age should serve as a warning to us that when we see the word modern in the future, we shouldn't necessarily think of it in its literal sense of right now. Though the historical sense of modern is definitely linked to the colloquial meaning of now. Less with the right now than with the awareness of rapid change that intensifies our division between the modern and the older before time. We've seen how this rate of change varies, with moments like the centuries surrounding 1500 being extremely dense with change, so much so that it seems to utterly transform our world, or at least the European world, and set off half a millennium of continuous modernization. Okay, so I hope you guys aren't taking notes. I'd rather you just sit back and listen and absorb and reflect. Although if note taking helps you do that, more power to you. But a lot of the material I'm covering today, while it's important to understand, helping us understand modernism, modernist art, it's not totally crucial to the later topics we'll be discussing. This is more general knowledge for you. I should also mention that we're slowly funneling in on our subject here, but we need to start very broadly with different concepts of history. So within this 500 years that we term the modern era in Western history, we can identify another period of explosive modernization, which is the 19th century, which witnessed a rate of change that surpassed anything Europe had seen since 1500. And I'll note here that we are talking about the 1800s. But, and this is another moment of a pretentious moment, learn how to talk like a pretentious humanities professor, historian. Humanities scholars typically don't refer to different eras, different centuries as the 1900s or the 1800s. Usually refer to, so let's say the 19th century means the 1800s. So the first century AD took place from 1 AD to 100 AD. The second century was from 101 AD to 200 AD, etc. So the number in the name of the century doesn't match up with the number at the beginning of the first of the years. You have to subtract one. What do I mean by that? So for the 19th century, which is what we're discussing right now, you take the name of the century, the ordinal name, 19th century, you subtract 1 from it, 19 minus 1 equals 18, and then you multiply by 100 to get the name of the first year of that century. 18 times 100 is 1800. So I should also clarify that, of course, we for this course, we'll be talking about the 20th century. What years are that, Joe? Take the 20, subtract 1, 19 times 100, 1900s. But the artwork that we'll be discussing is in large part a response to modernization, a process of modernization, an explosion of modernization that had already been occurring during the century before. So it's crucial in our lecture today to focus on years, a century, the 19th century, the 1800s, that we won't be discussing for this course, but the changes that took place during this century are so profound and that we need to consider them, because what happened in the following century, the 20th century, the 1900s, are a reaction to this previous century. I hope that makes sense. So just be aware, right now we are talking about a big period of change in the 1800s, the 19th century. And I'll show you why that is. We can visualize it very well by sharing screen. So we can visualize it by looking at population growth since the Middle Ages, since the 1050. So as you can see here, global population remains relatively stable and well below 1 billion people globally until the year 1500, the beginning of the modern era in Europe, when it slowly starts to increase. Then right around 1800, it suddenly shoots up, reaching over 1 billion by 1850 and increasing exponentially around the year 1900. So you can tell that there's something going on between 1800 and 1900, and then at 1900 it shoots off as a result of whatever happened during those years. So whatever happened during those years? I don't know. Give me a second. So there was the population of Europe also reflects this mass expansion of explosion of population. It more than doubled over the course of the 19th century to reach 400 million. What is more, there was a mass urban migration of this expanding population. 90% of Europeans were still living in rural environments at the beginning of the century, but that diminished to about 2/3 of the population by the end of the century, with 1/3 of the population based in cities. In the year 1800, London was the only city in Europe with over 1 million, but that expanded to 13 cities by 1900. Also during this period, the colonialist expansion we saw beginning with Columbus and the Age of Exploration around 1492 reached a peak in the 19th century. By the beginning of the 20th century, around the year 1900, 85% of the world's geography was under European control as colonies, semi-colonies, or commonwealths. This imperial expansion was fueled by the Industrial Revolution, that is the transition from handmade production to machinery and factory production in the first half of the 19th century. This was the beginnings of the mass consumer economy with affordable manufactured goods that largely improved the quality of life in many ways, but which also produced new economic inequalities as capitalism entered a new stage. The skilled urban craftsmen or bourgeoisie who had emerged as a new middle class around the year 1500, we discussed this, were no longer in the traditional trades of shoemaker or barrel maker or whatever maker, but they had become factory owners, landlords, businessmen, bankers, everyone that Karl Marx railed against for controlling the means of production. There was a sense of a kind of new and corrupt neo-feudalism emerging, with a greater disparity in wealth between the bourgeois class and the laborer class, who were treated, again, like peasants or serfs or slaves in these horrible working conditions depicted by people like Charles Dickens. This would ultimately lead to new economic forms such as communism and socialism, often enforced after very bloody revolutions, such as the one in Russia. Other changes, major changes during the 19th century, the 1800s. There was the invention of the telegraph. There's new forms of mass communication, the invention of the telegraph, which allowed for an instantaneous communication across vast distances, eventually across the Atlantic Ocean. News could arrive sooner and from further afield, and there was a new culture of mass circulation newspapers and magazines that emerged at the end of the century. By this point, around 1900, there was near universal literacy in Europe, with about 90% of industrialized Europe being able to read. Likewise, new developments in mass transportation, with steamships and railways that made travel within Europe and across the world more feasible and affordable. There was a greater movement of people who were no longer tied down to their immediate village with the same permanency as the past. Also, faster movement within cities with the development of commuter rails. Things like trolleys, tram cars, and eventually subways were part of a modernization of urban planning. Cities which had once been dirty and dangerous at the beginning of the 19th century were becoming safer and cleaner places to live, especially in upper and middle class neighborhoods and the suburbs that were emerging. These suburbs were only possible with faster commuter transportation, so that you can live out on the outskirts of Paris, but work where business is conducted in the city center. Speaking of Paris, the reason I chose that is not arbitrarily, but because these major shifts during the 19th century were especially observable in Paris, which was the undisputed capital of modernity on the European continent in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. There were massive renovation projects beginning in the 1850s that eliminated the dilapidated neighborhoods and replaced them with tree-lined boulevards, apartment blocks, shopping arcades, and parks. Oh, when I say arcades, I don't mean Pac-Man arcades. An arcade is like a covered walkway. In fact, I have a funny story. I was living in Hungary for a little bit, which also was modeled after Paris and Vienna, and has a wonderful covered walkway. And I told my friend, I'll meet you in the arcade. Coincidentally, this covered walkway, this arcade, had an arcade in it, had a video game arcade within the arcade. So I told her I would meet her at the architectural arcade. She went to the video game arcade within that arcade. Ha ha ha, we found each other eventually. I gave her a very pretentious architecture lesson, like the one I'm giving you now. Anywho, this was the beginnings of the modern open urban landscape that you see in many, is reflected in many cities today. You can only get a sense of the old, what cities used to look like by going into old European towns that have a medieval city center and the kind of labyrinthine streets that wasn't laid out in nice boulevards or array, or New York cross hatching, or these big round things with the spokes coming out. Those are modern developments. They were, even though they're very picturesque and cute now, Disneylandish. I think at the beginning of the 19th century and before, these could be very terrifying places to live, with lots of corners for Jack the Ripper to pop out at you. Speaking of Jack the Ripper, the gaslighting and public transportation meant it was possible to go about the city quickly and safely, even at night. The pinnacle of this urban modernization in Paris was symbolically represented by the wrought iron Eiffel Tower, this tower of light, which reflecting the city of lights, that it's all lit up. That's not just some silly nickname. It's the city is now being lit at night through gas lighting, and it's possible to go around at night. The city becomes a pleasure ground, a playground to go to cabarets and not be so worried about being mugged. So the Eiffel Tower was also a fitting symbol of human beings' Europe's accomplishments. The tallest man-made structure ever built when it was built for the World's Fair in 1889. These World's Fairs were also these kind of showing off of modernity. They showcased new developments of technology. You had all these little pavilions to see, oh, here's a demonstration of how the telegraph works. Unfortunately, there were also these kind of human zoos that showed off, that's literally what they're called, I'm not using that, that showed different indigenous peoples from around Europe's different colonies, to show the people they had conquered and their strange exotic cultures from around the globe. But this also did put artists who were genuinely interested in learning about these cultures. This is how they learned about these new cultures. We'll discuss that later. Not just a greater mingling with other cultures, albeit with this horrible kind of situation, but also a greater mingling of classes of white Europeans, the aristocrats, members of the bourgeoisie, and the common everyday people were starting to encounter one another more with greater frequency out on the street and in public settings like department stores, cabarets, and music halls, where you're in a seat next to a tramp, kind of an everyday person. So in Paris of this era, we start to see the emergence of a modernist reaction to all these rapid changes of the 19th century. For example, the emergence of a countercultural bohemian reaction, a countercultural bohemian class of artists who withdrew from the values of bourgeois life. These new artists who were emerging are, they can be summed up by this kind of archetypical figure of modernity in Paris, who was known as the flaneur. This isn't one particular person. This is how would you call it? An archetype, people you would see out on the street every day. These the word flaneur, F-L-A-N-E-U-R, means a stroller or a loafer or a loiterer. Stroller as in one who strolls, not a baby pram. So this is a distinctively modern archetype, an idle young man, usually male, that's just why I say man, who wanders the urban landscape aimlessly and observes the spectacle of the city. So artists of this era would place themselves in the position of this flaneur figure through their art. through their art, they would imagine themselves as the on-the-ground connoisseurs of modernity, who are absorbing and reflecting on everyday Parisian street life. And in many cases, these artists were literally flaneurs themselves, going around, with their hands in their pockets, slowly strolling down the Champs-Élysées, and oh, a fight's breaking out. Oh, someone got run over by a streetcar. These changes occurring, and then would go and reflect on it in their art, perhaps in their studio, or perhaps right there on the street or in the park where they would paint. So one of the predominant movements in art during the 19th century, remember, we're still talking about the 1800s, the 19th century, we haven't quite made it to the 20th century yet, but one of the dominant movements in art of this period was seeking to achieve an objective view of reality. Their art would wanted to show a stark and unbiased depiction of modernity that came to be known as realism or naturalism, with authors like Balzac, Zola, and Flaubert. And when I list these, when I do this name dropping, this is more of like, oh, I've heard of that person, or to give you a chance if you're interested to look these people up, or you can just ignore them, to be honest. So this realist movement, though, while it may sound like the flaneur figure, and in many cases it may have been, but it has less to do with the perspective of the flaneur than with another archetypical urban figure of Paris, to whom the flaneur figure was opposed, the opposite of. This was the Badaud, Badaud, which is the gawker or the bystander, who's undifferentiated from the rest of the crowd, part of an undiscerning mass of open-mouthed spectators who are absorbed into the modern world without critique. The flaneur, by contrast, emerges as a better symbol for the modernist artist of the 20th century, as well as the late 19th century. There's some overlap there. So the flaneur is better representative of how the modernist, we're getting to modernism finally, how a modernist artist observes modernity, but also maintains his or her individuality and capacity to reflect his personal subjective experience of modernity, which encapsulates the beginnings of what we term modernism or modernist art in the early 20th century and like I said, the late 19th century. So living in the world of modernity, of being a flaneur out and about observing it, demanded new modes of viewing it and depicting it as an artist. The modernist artist developed novel techniques and approaches to capture this constantly changing world of modernity. This also meant challenging or getting rid of old rules and assumptions of art, the styles that suited the old world, but were no longer sufficient to express modernity. There was a recognition amongst modernist artists, that the traditional and true-to-life methods by which reality was represented didn't convey the authentic experience as viewed from the subjective perspective of the individual, what it was really like to be a flaneur in this brave new world of modernity. We'll return to the artists now, but I wanted to address also that this realization that art wasn't quite reflecting authentic experience. This was also brought on by a major paradigm shift in science and philosophy of the late 19th and early 20th century. So during the 19th century, there was a move away from the positivist approach of the Enlightenment. And by positivist, I mean everything in the world, the idea that everything in the world could be theoretically explained using reason and logic, that the universe follows laws that hold true no matter where you are, and that humans have the ability to systematically accumulate and verify our knowledge of the world with the goal of improving our lives through this knowledge. Yet, so this is the idea that prevailed in Europe till about 1800. But new discoveries totally undermined this positivist model beginning in the 19th century and gave rise to a less certain model of knowledge that posited a multiplicity of realities, while also taking into greater account how our subjective experience colors the world we live in. When I say subjective, I mean one's personal perspective, the individual's personal perspective versus the objective, the idea that there is the reality out in the world, existing independent of one's view of it. So notions of history changed. The previous model of Hegel, this historical philosopher Hegel, was one of linear cause and effect, with the human species continuously progressing. This model of history, in which the course of humankind progressed under the guidance of some spirit of world history, was challenged by intellectuals like Karl Marx, who argued that events were the consequence of the material conditions at a given moment, that there wasn't some grand teleological design to history, but that the outcomes emerged as immediate changes in material reality, a history that was in constant flux and demanded new political and economic responses to the changes wrought by modernization. So Darwin's radical theory of evolution dovetailed with Marx's ideas in that the immediate material conditions of nature, in this case, the cutthroat struggle for survival, that these conditions determined the outcome of a species. This raised the uncomfortable implication that the very survival of our species is at the whim of some blind force of nature, that no matter how systematically we apply our knowledge as humans, we are not in control of our fate, nor can we predict or safeguard our existence with any certainty, that the logic and linearity of our past system of knowledge was being replaced by the accumulation of random and unforeseeable events. There were analogous breakthroughs in science, such as Niels Bohr's work on subatomic particles and Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which held that the rate that time passes depends on your relative frame of reference. It led us to understand that there were different levels of the physical universe that followed different laws, that Newtonian physics, that we couldn't apply our regular Newtonian physics of the everyday world. And in fact, the principles that govern these different levels, the subatomic level, the regular Newtonian everyday world, and the cosmic level, that these could even be mutually exclusive, the laws that determine these different physical levels. There was also the emergence of the newly formed field of psychology, and we see a comparable shifts in our conception of human beings and our mind. Figures like William James, Edmund Husserl, and Henry Bergson, again, don't worry about these names so much, just know these guys reconceived of consciousness not as a fixed state, but as a steady stream or flow of memories and sensations that overlap. Time, though still measured chronologically, is also experienced subjectively, again, from one's own perspective, as we register our experiences in the world against our own flow of consciousness. Of course, this concept of multiple levels of consciousness also pertains to the work of Freud, who theorized the unconscious mind beneath our immediate awareness. This is our latent or repressed desires, our impulses and complexes that bubble beneath our awareness. It's a part of our psyche that is accessible only through things like dreams or Freudian slips when we use the wrong word. Sociology was another emerging discipline, also began to consider the psychological effects of modernization on individuals and on society. Emil Durkheim addressed the increase in suicide rates during the 19th century which was attributed to the which he attributed to the uprooting of social and moral standards during the century. Max Weber and Georg Simmel saw capitalist or government bureaucracies and the metropolis itself as iron cages that trap individuals and increase their sense of alienation and isolation. Finally, the last part of this paradigm shift I'll mention is Europe's contact with non-Western peoples. As that increased, sociologists started to rethink our relationship to other races and ethnicities. Durkheim, who I mentioned, the sociologist, as well as people like Marcel Mauss and Lucien Levy-Bruhl, argued that there was no inherent difference between so-called primitive peoples and Europeans, that cultural differences were attributable to a people's transition from a traditional to a modern way of life, and modern in the European sense. That Europeans were at a later stage of this modernization process, but had emerged as a similarly primitive, from a similarly primitive origin that relied on magic and superstition to explain the world rather than scientific rationality. And again, this is seen through, I'm just repeating the ideas of this day. And of course, there have been changes in ways we reconsider this, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what a context for how sociologists were rethinking what had come before. This idea that other groups of people there was something inherent racially inherent that made them lesser, somehow less complex, less developed, and held them back. Sociologists were actually very forward thinking to say no, that this is that's all measured by this European timeline, this and against the backdrop of European modernization, that these non-Western peoples could and eventually did, as we'll see, develop in this pattern of European and Western modernization. And that we as Westerners, as European Westerners, came from these kind of origins. Especially a peasant culture during the Middle Ages, which relied heavily on magic and what you might call superstitious beliefs, folk beliefs. Again, don't feel overwhelmed by all these names and ideas. The important concept to glean from this perceptual revolution of the 19th century and into the 20th century, we're getting there, is that modernist artists were responding to a world that was marked not only by the modernist changes I've discussed, but by a total transformation in the way we perceive the world. It was as if the rug had been pulled from beneath European society, and there was no longer anything stable or concrete to latch onto, as there had been since, say, the days of the Enlightenment, when you could put all of human knowledge and you could catalog it in these encyclopedias. There it is, the 4 volumes. This is what we know, and we can keep adding on to it. Things started to, there's tangle and self-contradiction, and my perspective is just as good as your perspective. Though that group of people is way of life is just as valid as our way of life. That was scary and confusing for them, as you could imagine. So core concepts of reason and linearity that gave us a reliable view of reality were replaced with a constant flux of relativism. What is more, a world where humans are we began to see a world, this scary Darwinian world, where humans are no longer in control of their own fate, but subject to the whim of illogical and unfeeling forces, be it the nature, the capitalist market, or the unconscious, the scariest of all, ourselves. So this perceptual revolution, along with the rapid changes of modernization, the technological advances, etc., and especially the industrialization that seemed to mechanize society itself and even everyday life, the beginnings of this horrible bureaucracies, this forced individuals into a horrible feeling of alienation. They were now disconnected from any sense of a shared reality, of a fundamental truth with a capital T. So the individual retreated into his or her own subjective experience of reality, whatever reality was, or if it even existed. It's fun, I know. So we can keep all of this in mind as we return now to our concept of the artist as the flaneur of modernity, the on-the-ground observer of these changes. Artists coming out of the 19th century filled this position of the individual expressing his or her subjective experiences in the world, a world where that's all you could rely on was your own subjective experience. The goal of art was no longer to convey some objective reality or truth, a concept that was being challenged time and time again in even something as fundamental as physics. These artists were also fed up with the assumptions and values of the art forms that they had been trained in, the stifling confines of traditional artistic practice. Modernist artists, and beginning, especially in the 20th century, broke off to form their own movements that would be truer to their subjective experiences. In this climate of modernity, the old techniques that had been taught them were insufficient for expressing this brave new world, this rapid change of the time period, which demanded a constant development of novel techniques to keep up with these changes. There was a sense of experimentation among the modernists akin to science, of breaking new ground and being ahead of the crowd, i.e. being avant-garde, a term that emerged from French military parlance, where it meant troops that advance ahead of the rest of the army, bravely penetrating into the unknown. And so, beginning in the late 19th century, and then quickly multiplying in the 20th century, the period we're looking at, are groups of like-minded artists who come together to organize movements that are separate from the dominant styles and institutions of the day. An archipelago of isms begin to form. When I say isms, the letters I-S-M, ism. These are the names given to these movements, either by the adherents of themselves, the people in the movements, or by outsiders, critics and historians, sometimes much, much later in history. Typically, and why I call them isms, is they end with those three letters, just like modernism, the blanket term modernism. These are something akin to the numerous Protestant sects that emerged in the Protestant sects that emerged in the wake of Luther's Reformation. It was very similar, actually. While that's in the realm of religion and Christianity, this idea that there is a prescribed set way of doing things, and now we're breaking off, but we're not breaking off as one big movement, even though we may apply a term to that all of this larger movement, modernism, but that there's all these little schisms, and that they might actually agree on some things and probably disagree on other things. So let's look at a few of these in the visual arts. We'll get to music, I swear to gosh. So we can more quickly register the artist's modernist aesthetic through painting than if we were to sit here and read a whole poem, read an excerpt from a book, or listen to a whole orchestral work. It's painting is we can more immediately get an idea of these different the tenets of these different isms by looking at a painting. So that's why for these few little isms that I'm going to show, why I'm choosing painting over another art form. So the one you may be the most familiar with is Impressionism. It's one of the earliest and best known of these modernist isms, which predated the core of modernism in the early 20th century. So it actually originated during the 1870s and 80s, so the late 19th century. this painting, Claude Monet's 1872 impression Sunrise, which does offer a nice summary of the movement and its tenets. So traditional landscape painting had portrayed vast vistas where everything was crisply delineated, in focus, and brightly lit. But as the name of the title of Monet's impression implies, the painting is truer to an individual's subjective experience, to Monet's personal impression of this view at the given moment. Impressionists typically painted quickly to capture this moment, and as Monet has done here, capturing sunrise. You can see the quick, small paint strokes applied to wet paint on wet paint to give it this mosaic feel in the water, or the fuzzy smear effect for the clouds and ships. No shapes are outlined to give a clear focus. There's no pretense at creating a picture window illusion to trick the eye into thinking that this is real. In fact, the paint strokes are on display. You can clearly see the movement of the brush and the texture of the paint, especially in the water section and in the red part of the clouds. Yet this quick process of action painting executed in the open air, which was unusual for the time, feels closer to how we actually see the world. We don't sit to contemplate every detail, nor can we focus equally on every part of a landscape. That's not quite true. We do that, but that's an older way of doing things, I would say. That's where the romantic way of doing things. You climb a mountain, you sit, and you look out for several hours. This is something, what Monet is doing is something closer to the modernist experience. You ain't got time to do that. You got to go make that paper, you know? So you may turn your head very quickly, and this is what you see as you walk along the docks to go to your job at the docks. But you don't have the time to sit there and contemplate it. Excuse me. So this feels closer to how we actually see the world. The world seems to pass by in a blur, much of it out of focus or in our peripheral vision. Impressionists are less concerned with the figures in the landscape as with questions of lighting and color, hence the rather blurry portion of the shipyard to the right, or whatever this is. The subject of this painting is less the shipyard itself than the texture of the water, in the sense of gentle rippling and movement of the water. There's also the play of reflections on the ocean here, especially the patch of red reflection from the sun. There's a strange appearance and red color of the sun itself as seen through the haze. Also the haze itself and the way it envelops the ships, the way the smoke from the smokestacks, a symbol of modernity here, blend in with the clouds, the haze, and the reflecting water to create a uniform grayish blue. Also the subtle variations in this shade, especially between the water and the land. That's what this painting is about. It's more about those things than about a ship or a harbor or a little rowboat man. Monet especially would create several different paintings of the same building, haystack, or pond at different times of day, different seasons, and in different weather. Again, he's trying to capture his perception of these places at a given time, rather than to capture its essence, the essence of the footbridge or the essence of the haystack itself. These objects are just that, mere objects for which the sunlight can reflect off of, colors can change, weather can spit rain on, and that's what Monet is concerned with. Impressionism may not have the same sense of novelty today as it did for the Parisian public, who found this shocking, maybe not so much shocking, but unusual and weird and off-putting. In fact, Impressionism comes from a guy who is a critic who was criticizing this movement and who picked up the title of Monet's painting and accused him of just sketching out a painting, not quite finishing a painting, that it was unfinished, that it didn't look like the things it was depicting. But today it's almost this style is almost universally accepted as beautiful, and posters paintings by Monet, Renoir, Van Gogh. Here's another pretentious moment. Van Gogh is Van Gogh in Dutch. So you can really annoy your friends by telling them that. So Van Gogh and Degas, their paintings will no doubt adorn many of your dorm room walls. Yet the same spirit of these earliest modernist works also runs through the more revolutionary works of the early 20th century. And those works, the weirder, stranger, or shocking works, are extensions of the same radical approach to subjectivity that gets underway in movements like Impressionism, which sought to find innovative ways of capturing the individual's unique perspective. While it may look extremely different from Impressionism, Cubism deals with the same fundamental Impressionist question, which is the fundamental modernist question of how we see the world, individually, subjectively. While Impressionism dealt primarily with landscapes or waterscapes and cityscapes, Cubism is concerned with a smaller scale, with the still life and portraiture. Also, while Impressionists dealt with the artist's perspective of a location at one specific moment, Cubism dealt with multi-perspectives of more permanent objects or seemingly permanent objects. The fact that we get to know an object or a person from multiple points of view is taken into consideration. That we get up and we go to the other side of the room and see a vase or a guitar from a different angle and different sizes given perspective, that totally transforms its shape and its size, and yet it's still the same object. Also, the fact that objects have backs and sides, and that we're able to get up and see these parts of the object in real life, but which aren't portrayed in traditional painting, which is single perspective. Also, the fact that people don't remain stationary, even when they're sitting and having a conversation with us, but they move, they turn, they shift, and they gesture. Cubism is obviously associated with Pablo Picasso, or probably Picasso, as I like to call him, whose earliest Cubist works are dated around 1907. This is a much later work from 1937 titled Weeping Woman, but we can see some of the core concepts of Cubism. There's the multiple perspectives of the woman's face. The outline of her face, the darkest outline, seems to imply that we're seeing it in profile, or at least mostly angled to the side, to our right. The nose juts out. We only see one ear, only half of her hair, and only about 2/3 of the mouth and chin. And yet, both of the eyes and eyebrows are fully visible, as if she were facing us head on. Given the subject of this painting, a woman who is weeping, the most important part of her anatomy is featured, the eyes. And therefore, Picasso ensures that even though the rest of her face may be turned to her left, our right, we have a full view of her tortured button-like eyes. Regarding the handkerchief, we seem to have multiple time perspectives, not only space perspectives, but time perspective, or perhaps even a kind of X-ray vision. Even though the handkerchief is lifted over her mouth to dab her tears, we can still see the grimacing expression of her mouth, almost like an after image in our memory that stays in our mind after the handkerchief hides our view. We also get a sense of movement from her hands, a simultaneous before and after sequence, with one position represented by the lower set of mostly green and yellow hands, and the other dabbing handkerchief position, represented by the white hands. You could think maybe you could put one after another and get a flip book or film. That's how film works. Two different, the before, the after, put them very quickly, and it seems like a fluid motion. This is almost like we're seeing a double exposure of a film, with the before the handkerchief was put up and the after the handkerchief was put up simultaneously. So it appears that she has 4 hands. This painting also demonstrates another component of Cubism that is kind of the stereotype of Cubism as blocky, straight edge style from which we derive that name, Cubism. So many of these paintings look like they've been split up into a million little blocks. So we have some very unnatural angles and color palettes. It's less concerned with capturing the natural curves of a woman's face than with conveying her emotional state, which starts to bring us away from Cubism, as we'll see in a second. So let's consider the heavy, intense line that represents her furrowed brow, the ghost-like appearance of the handkerchief that has sucked all the color from her face and left her looking deathly pale in the kind of X-ray part of the painting. There's the stark contrast between the colors that aren't washed out by the handkerchief. These garish greens, yellows, purples, and oranges, which are in a purposefully garish and almost bad taste. The cubist twisting and contorting of her form, especially the way Picasso represents her eyelids in strange, unnatural positions. Her eyebrows are tilting at extreme, impossible angles, and her ear is made to look like it's being squeezed by what I think is supposed to be her earring. There's the way the tear falls down her face as if it were actually part of her face, another appendage or body part that's permanently attached to her eyelid, as if the tears and this sadness will last forever, like a body part. There's the intensity of her eyes, the most important thing, with their X-shaped pupils and their eyelashes that jut straight out. So all these components of painting, which might be stereotypes associated with Cubism, actually have to do more with what we call expressionism, whereby the internal state is reflected in the external features of a painting. And we'll discuss this movement of expressionism later in the term. But for now, I'll mention that there's an overlap between 2 isms in this painting, between Cubism and expressionism. And this is very, very, very common in the modernist period. While a few modernist artists vehemently and almost religiously aligned themselves with the mission of their team or their schism, which is why I bring up the Protestant schisms, why it's so similar. So while they may, root for their own team and remain diehard fans, most figures, I would argue, can't be tied down to one ism and move freely between these isms or combine different styles. Sometimes the names of the isms were applied later by critics or scholars to describe a certain feature common to many artists' works, but that the artists themselves didn't necessarily ascribe to a movement by that name. So, how do I put it? We shouldn't think of these isms as if they were Hogwarts houses, that you're sorted into your house and must stay loyal to its fellow members and whatever characteristics are assigned to Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs. Certainly, some isms did perform this function for some artists, that especially groups like surrealism or futurism. We'll discuss futurism later. That they had their manifestos and they excommunicated former members who had sinned against these isms. So how do I put this? There were some people who did view them like Hogwarts houses. For the most part, I think it's more useful to think of them as impulses or characteristics of a work, a useful way of describing certain features or techniques, but not necessarily pigeonholing or sorting these works and these artists into a single ism. Multiple isms can exist side by side within the same work, as we saw within the combination of Cubist and Expressionist elements in this painting by Picasso. Another example, but an example of an ism that wasn't really a movement defined by its artist members, but rather a trend or a recurring motive or characteristic that was in the air during the modernist period was the appropriation of non-Western arts, especially the so-called primitive or tribal art of indigenous African, Oceanic, and Native American peoples. Also might artists might have found inspiration in folk or ancient cultures, including those of Europe and Russia. So the most famous example of this so-called primitivism is Picasso's 1907 Demoiselle d'Avignon, which is sometimes cited as the first Cubist painting. Again, another instance of different isms overlapping, and Cubism certainly overlapped quite a bit with primitivism, especially in the work of Picasso. So we can see in this, this new non-Western source of inspiration in the depiction of the two women on the right, on our right of this Picasso painting. The faces of these two women are stylized in a manner similar to the elongated masks of the forest-dwelling Fang people of Western Africa. There was a huge, so along with this huge expansion of colonialism that I mentioned, there was an increased interest in and exposure to the arts and crafts of colonized peoples. Picasso and his colleagues would have seen these objects in books, exhibitions, exhibition catalogs, and events like the World's Fair, which had these different events to showcase the arts of the colonized people. Of course, there's plenty to find objectionable in this in primitivism from our present day point of view. Not least of which is the fact that the original significance of these objects is not acknowledged in the art. There's no sense of the people who created them or their function of these objects, many of which held deep spiritual meaning. At the same time, I think there was a genuine, albeit mostly misguided and paternalistic, sense of appreciation for the stylized modes of depictions in these arts that was totally antithetical to the realist mode of arts that these artists had inherited and had been trained in. In most cases, these modernist artists weren't placing the white modern European as superior to the non-white primitive by incorporating these non-Western artifacts into their works. Rather, I don't know what I wrote here. I think I meant to say that they were comparing these cultures with European modernity, not placing one above the other, but rather placing them side by side as this kind of experiences were happening in the world of modernity, that you would get off the street of a subway car and then go into an exhibition at the World's Fair and see Maori art from New Zealand on display. So they were getting in touch with and showing an appreciation for ways of life that were connected with the worlds of magic and spirits, important elements of life and living that had been lost to Europeans during the modern age. There was a sense that these are important aspects of traditional society that modernization did away with and labeled as inferior and ignorant. But there was also a realization amongst modernist artists that human rationality was no longer sufficient to explain reality, and that so-called superstition could fill in the gaps left by science and also help us to understand ourselves where science left off. So this turn toward older, or in the case of primitivism, this turn toward older or ancient modes of expression, at least by European standards, even though many of these cultures that created these works of art were still thriving, a lot of times Europeans viewed their ways of life as older, hence primitive. This is something of a paradox that I've noticed in modernism that I'm hoping to address more in this class. There's a misconception that's built into the very name of modernism that artists of this period were concerned solely with the new and the novel, that they were constantly reinventing the wheel with each new work of art to keep up with the rapid changes of modernization. That's true to some extent. There were certainly utopianist strains of modernism to create a better world that had never been imagined before. We see this to some extent, for example, in abstract art, which totally abandoned all pretense of living. You know what? I'm going to put myself on the screen. I don't want to just keep. I'm just as beautiful as the Demoiselle of d'Avignon. So, like I said, there's certainly a utopianist strain of modernism that wanted to create this brave new world and contribute to it and speed it along. We see that to some extent in abstract art, totally abandoned, trying to represent not just reality, but represent anything as we see it, houses and dogs. Rather, artists like Kandinsky sought to express the inexpressible in art, to represent sounds, emotions, the inner world of the soul, not with the crude shapes of everyday reality, but with the abstract shapes and colors that more immediately convey the ineffable and the unrepresentable. Of course, it's always going to be a failing mission, but it's a brave and courageous and utopianist mission. In many cases, however, artists did indeed look back in history for artistic styles and techniques that they could emulate and replicate. While modernity is certainly a hyper-awareness of living in the now, by no means does this entail a total severing of ties with the then, which is a very long then. Very often, when artists rejected tradition, they were rejecting the immediate inherited tradition that they had been taught. Many of these artists had attended conservatories and academies where they were taught the right way of composing, sculpting, or drawing. Yet what constitutes correct or beautiful is constantly changing over time. So while artists may have been reacting to the aesthetics of the relatively recent history, that is the inherited aesthetics that they had been taught, they may have also felt a kinship with even older styles that had been forgotten or ignored or were no longer taught in their academies. For example, the pre-Raphaelite movement. It's another early modernist movement, proto-modernist movement of the 19th century, a little bit like Impressionism. This movement looked to medieval art, the name meaning before Raphael and before the Renaissance. So long gone styles were indeed new in the sense that they're being rediscovered by the modernist generation. The same is true of primitivist art, in that even though these objects have nothing to do with European modernism, and in some cases may have existed for thousands of years before the 20th century, they are novel to the artists encountering them for the first time. And what is more, rarely do painters simply resurrect the styles of these earlier eras wholesale. Something akin to like what do you call it? I forget the word, but you know what a museum might do to renovation, is that what it's called? That if a painting comes in and half of it is destroyed, they recreate the exact pigments of the paint and fill it in exactly with the brushes, with the exact marmoset hair or whatever their kind of brush they're using, and exact they try and get it exact, as if so an intentional forgery, you could call it. So what I'm saying is that modernists weren't doing that. They weren't trying to create a painting in the style of Leonardo. Almost said Da Vinci. Oh, wouldn't that be embarrassing? So they weren't practicing the same exact same techniques and depicting exactly the same subject matter. Rather, they were putting these in the service of some modernist message, looking to the past to respond to the present, as the art of the distant past, as opposed to the relatively recent past might be better equipped to express the condition of modernity. It's a rather paradoxical view, but I think we'll encounter it many times and see how it manifests itself, especially in music. Now, back to our regularly scheduled slideshow. Another ism. So that being said, there were, of course, artists who dealt in themes and subjects that were obviously modern in the colloquial sense, having to do with modernity. The futurist movement might be less familiar to you than the big isms like Cubism and Impressionism or maybe Expressionism, not to mention the other big isms I've had to leave out today for the purposes of time: Symbolism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Constructivism, etc.ism. Part of this has to do with the fact that the futurist, the fact that the reason why you probably haven't heard of futurism is that the Italian originators of this movement had much to do, unfortunately, with the founding of fascism, another ism, not an artistic ism. The founding of fascism in the first decade of the 20th century. Indeed, many of these isms have strong associations with two radical political movements that dominated the early 20th century: communism and fascism. Modernist art was seen by some of its creators not only as a reflection or a response to the changes of modernization, but also a means of generating change by depicting an ideal world for us to live in, or by giving a bleak picture of what the world really is, or could become if left to its own devices, and to inspire the public to take political action for themselves. The ideal world for the futurists that they envisioned emphasized the technological advances of modernization: machines, velocity, metal, noise, skyscrapers, trains, radio waves, electricity. The reason I say it so weirdly is because a lot of their poetry, that's what it looked like. They would focus on the typographical aspects of the poet and have like automatopoeias like zing and boom and crash, all the sounds of the modern world, and they would lay it out on the page in big visual crescendos. The word would start small and then get bigger as you went along. Or when they would read their poetry, they would do these little sounds like things, little sounds of machines. Their art emphasized movement, especially in a way that overlaps with Cubism and also with Kandinsky's abstract art. You can see that in Luigi Russolo's Dynamism of a Car from 1913, which I've shown here, where we see the car's direction and speed represented by these red chevrons, the angles of which become more acute from left to right, perhaps indicating the intensification of speed. The car itself is largely obscured, surrounded in a blue kind of envelope that might represent its aerodynamics. We see some yellow stripes emerging from behind the tires, turning the car's contact with the pavement into jets of fire or rays of sunlight. The buildings in the background are sleek, modern skyscrapers, but they're also angled to give the sense that the car is going so quickly that the city has become a tilted blur flying past. Picasso had used many of these different techniques, these cubist, abstract, and expressionist techniques to convey human emotions. We saw that in the Weeping Woman, that was the subject, was the subject, the emotion of sadness. But here, the futurists are glorifying the mechanical, believing our species should strive for the purity and dynamism of its technological creations. In Russolo's painting, the person driving the car has become one with its vehicle. He's the same blue color. His head is angled forward into the direction of the chevrons, becoming one with the movement of the car itself. The more uncomfortable aspects of futurism start to emerge as we bring this topic up in these dehumanizing depictions. Even more so when we consider their glorification of technology also extended to the violence of modern warfare. They saw the war as purifying, something they even called it hygienic, to cleanse the world of cowardice and decadence and pave the way for a bright chrome-covered future. Granted, the futurists were given just such a war between 1914 and 17, the bloodiest conflict in Western history up until that point. The mechanization of modernity was indeed applied to warfare, but not in the beautiful ways that the futurists imagined. Whatever heroism or romanticism had still clung to traditional warfare, the riding of your horse into the fray, engaging in hand-to-hand combat on the battlefield, had totally disappeared. Most of a soldier's time was spent in these horrible trenches, often filled with water or mud, days on end of deafening bombardment across a miles-wide stretch of nothing called no man's land, a wasteland of human bodies. Man indeed became more like a futurist machine. This was the first major war in which tanks and airplanes were used. Most horrible of all was the use of chemical warfare. Poisonous gases like chlorine, tear gas, and mustard gas were pumped across no man's land into enemy territory, causing burns and asphyxiation. Usually didn't kill the victims, but maimed and disfigured them forever. Men became like terrifying, inhuman beings as they donned gas masks to protect themselves from the chemical agents that were eventually forbidden by international humanitarian law. This horrible Great War had little of a good versus evil distinction between good guys and bad guys. It came about because of tensions within a complicated network of political and imperial alliances in Europe and globally. The squabble of old men, politicians, and aristocrats led to the deaths of millions of young men, not to mention civilians, male and female, in the unimaginable conditions I've only begun to describe to you. This was undeniably the climax of modernization, the industrialization and bureaucratization of society applied to warfare. Of course, another even more brutal and deadly conflict would soon follow, but because this course deals with the first half of the 20th century, World War I is of greater concern to us than World War II. But you can imagine what kind of physical and psychological trauma the Great War had in its catastrophic impact on both individuals and society. Most artistic reactions to the war weren't, as you can imagine, in the futuristic spirit of glorification of war, but we'll discuss this in greater detail later in the course. Okay, so this part of the video is actually disguised to make it look like we're discussing surrealism when in reality, we're taking attendance, which is a rather surrealist situation. Unfortunately, we're not going to discuss surrealism in this lecture, which is unfortunate because it's my favorite of the isms. I will mention here briefly, since we discussed Freud, that surrealism is a movement growing out of Freud's ideas. It's a systematic artistic response to Freud, where in an exploration of the unconscious through techniques like automatic writing and drawing, where you just let your hand go and hopefully separate your unconscious from your conscious being and tap into that world of violence and sexuality that's being repressed. So you often get very erotic or very violent images in surrealism. Or else the other technique is, of course, recording one's dreams or creating images that are reminiscent of a dream. Another way that Freud, in his psychoanalysis, tapped into the subconscious by analyzing dreams. So that's the surrealists picked it up as well in their artwork. This is a wonderful painting by the American surrealist Dorothea Tanning that I really, really love. The other surrealist, overlooked female surrealist who's getting more popular is Leonora Carrington. I just want to give her a shout out because she's has some incredible works as well. But that's not what we're discussing in this section right now. I'm going to give you a URL to a Google form that you can fill out. The mandatory section is the mandatory answers I want you to fill in are your UTOR ID and your name, so that your CA can take attendance. But there's also some optional questions about your background and what you're interested in, your major, etc. And we're going to use these forms in the future as a way to just keep up on you guys and allow you to respond to the course, or especially when we deal with the project, the final project, you can start to tell us what you're interested in covering, which work you're interested in responding to. Please do not give out this link or inform other people about how I'm going about taking attendance. I am going to be very, very strict about how I do attendance, and which is why it's being done in this kind of weird way. The reason is because I have reduced the workload so much for this course that I need you guys to keep up your end of the deal, which is simply to show up. And so I don't think I'm going out of line to keep attendance so strictly, since you're not being required to do any required readings or to do little, little responses, writing responses or whatever BS your other professors are having you do. It's a minimal workload. So show up and fill out the Google form. So I'm going to read it now. Get your browser ready, or a pencil if you want to write it down. Here it is. It's the usual https://. I don't think you always need that, but just in case, put it in again, https://. Then the word forms, FORMS, .gle, as in the 3 last letters of Google, then a /, and then a long list of letters and numbers that are both uppercase and lowercase. I'm going to read it slowly and carefully so that you can type it in correctly, and then I'll read it back again, just so you're for sure. So here it is. It's the number 2, lowercase v as in Victor, lowercase h as in house, lowercase n as in Nancy, uppercase q as in queen, uppercase p as in potato, lowercase t as in truck, lowercase c as in Charlie, lowercase s as in ship, uppercase t as in truck, uppercase v as in Victor, lowercase f as in Frank, uppercase p as in potato, lowercase c as in Charlie, the number 8, an uppercase X as in xylophone, and an uppercase A as in alligator. I'm going to read them again, but if you're having a lot of trouble and you just, one of the letters is, I'm saying, really, really weird or something, please just email me and I'll give you the dang link. But I prefer you try it out first, so I don't have to email a bunch. I don't have to respond to a bunch of emails like that. So here we go. I'm going to read through it all again once more. Try it out. If it works, wonderful, fill it out. If not, email me. Again, it's https:// forms, FORMS, the word forms, .gle, that is the last 3 letters of Google, then a /. Then we have number 2, lowercase v as in Victor, lowercase h as in house, lowercase n as in Nancy, uppercase q as in queen, uppercase p as in potato, lowercase t as in Tanya, lowercase c as in Charlie, lowercase s as in Samantha, uppercase t as in Tanya, uppercase v as in Victor, lowercase f as in Frank, uppercase p as in potato, lowercase c as in Charlie, the number 8, uppercase X as in xylophone, and uppercase A as in alligator. And that concludes our lecture on surrealism. Thank you. So, returning to this web of isms that emerged, as I mentioned, there are countless currents and cross currents to explore. If you're serious about this topic and plan to study it more in the future, perhaps as part of your degree, then you should most definitely read the first 80 or so pages of Robin Waltz's useful overview of it's just called Modernism, which I've been pulling from this book for parts of this lecture. It's a quick and straightforward introduction with many of the major modernist concepts and names of the isms. They're defined right in the margins for your convenience. For your optional reading this week, I've assigned the first 10 or so pages, which you can get on their Quercus site. And for our discussion here, I'd like to call your attention to the last few pages of this introduction, where Waltz brings up the work of the historian Eugene Lunn, who laid out the 4 broad dimensions of the modernist aesthetic. As we can see, modernism can't be defined by any one style or ism, that there are numerous movements, each with their own set of techniques, and that these factions often have competing and contradictory aims, as well as political leanings. At the most basic level, I have, rather redundantly, defined the larger umbrella of modernism as the artistic response to the rapid changes of modernity that had been ramping up during the 19th century. But Eugene Lunn helps draw some interconnecting threads between the modernist movements of the 20th century that help to unite this unruly archipelago by defining some broad themes that they share, 4 broad themes to be exact. The first is self-reflexivity, that the modernist work of art brings attention to itself, to its medium, its technique, its status as a work of art rather than as an illusion of reality. The modernist work of art can also be self-reflexive of the artist, him or herself, a reflection of their subjective experience. In turn, the viewer is also encouraged to find direct and personal meaning in this work. The second of these, what did he call them? Second of the 4 broad dimensions of the modernist aesthetic, simultaneity, that the work of modernist art no longer strives for naturalism, but becomes an amalgamation of words, images, and media within the same creation. Linearity, logic, and unity are replaced with fragmentation, multiplicity, and montage. The third dimension of modernism is uncertainty of meaning. But modernist art addresses the paradox, ambiguities, and uncertainties of modernity. The destabilization of the values that society had inherited. Art becomes a mean of defamiliarizing the world and challenging assumptions. And the final of these 4 dimensions is dehumanization, which we've seen as there's ample space for that after such a dehumanizing war. Humans are no longer the measure of the universe in modernity, but are the composite effect of external forces acting on the fragile human psyche. Humans are depicted in modernist art as distorted, abstracted, segmented, or else deprived of their fundamental humanity, presented as animalistic or mechanized. So in no way do these dimensions totally sum up modernism, but they are pertinent themes to keep in mind as we set out on our modernist voyage. You may want to keep them in the back of your mind or even as a checklist in your notes for each work. Not all of them will apply to each of the works, but it might be interesting to see the different ways that they do manifest. Also, between one work or the other, how one person may, like I mentioned here, one person may dehumanize a subject by making a character more like an animal or even part animal, whereas another, in a more futurist vein, may make a character more machine-like. On that note, we can start to home in on the topic of this course, which is, of course, music for theater in the 20th century. It's still a rather broad topic, which is why I'm limiting the scope to the first half of the 20th century, since these works have more common with each other than with the works from the second half of the century. The artists are often directly responding to each other's works, and the second half of the century, the post-World War II era, could take up an entirely different course. So that's why I'm leaving that part out. But we do have an interesting cross-disciplinary advantage in the fact that we're looking at music for theatrical works rather than so-called pure instrumental genres like the symphony or piano repertoire. Theater is an art form in which all the arts, or many of them anyway, can combine and intersect. Theater is an ideal venue for understanding both modernist music and modernity in general, since the genres of opera, ballet, and popular musical theater place the sonic dimension in dialogue with the visual, the textual, and the kinetic, with movement. In fact, in the late 19th century, thanks to the theories of composer Richard Wagner, whose ideas had a profound influence on modernists of all forms, this idea of art forms working together became more prominent and more recognized by proto-modernist and modernist artists. That's because Wagner was more than a mere composer, but a kind of high priest of art who oversaw every element of production in his massive operas. Wagner was disgusted by the degeneration of opera into a frivolous art form that was dominated by the music. The plots of operas from the genres 2.5 centuries, from 1600 to the mid-19th century, are notoriously idiotic. The text, known as a libretto, which means little book in Italian, I mentioned that, served mainly as a poetic vehicle for beautiful music. An opera wasn't experienced the same way that we might view a movie or a play. Its plots were deliberately simplified and easy to read, since often you were viewing one that was in a language you didn't speak, and the titles were not, the super titles weren't there. You couldn't read a translation. The dramatic tension came less from intelligent or even intelligible, if you can understand it. If you can understand the language, sometimes you can't understand what they're singing. So the dramatic tension came less from the dialogue and realistic acting than from the musical score and the virtuosic performances of the singers. Wagner, who was inspired by the unity of music and drama in each ancient Greek theater, which was originally sung or chanted, he sought to equalize the balance in a work of opera, reconceiving his contributions to the genre as music dramas so as to separate them from the music-driven opera of the past. This artwork of the future, as he called it, very proto-modernistically, would unite every aspect of a theatrical work toward a common artistic aim. In the dominant style of the early 19th century, the early 1800s, which was French grand opera, Wagner sensed a drifting apart of art forms, which he rather anti-Semitically pinned on the Jewish composer Giacomo Meyerbeer. So he thought that the music was pure vocal display. A singer could extract and perform segments of the opera unrelated to the plot as part of their concert performances. They might sing so-and-so's aria from something, but out of the context of the original opera. The staging often relied on spectacular yet gimmicky special effects that didn't advance the plot in any way. Castles that had collapsed in flames, giant ship deck sets where you're on the deck of a ship that I think some of them even rocked back and forth. An ice skating ballet scene. These are all, I'm taking these from operas by Meyerbeer, which I love. Don't get me wrong. These are the things that Wagner was criticizing. So the fact that Wagner was a 3-in-1 director, a librettist, he's a 3-in-1 artist as director, librettist, and composer of these music dramas allowed him to ensure that these constituent elements were working equally to advance his theatrical vision. There was no longer a sense of opera as a kind of cobbled together art form, with each aspect of the production concerned more with itself than with an overall multimedia synthesis. Music, staging, and text would work, in Wagner's view, should work hand in hand in a more perfect union. None of the three dominating the others. He wanted to create a total work of art, or a Gesamtkunstwerk in German, like Wagner's epic four-opera Ring Cycle, which is based on Norse mythology. Artists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were drawn to Wagner's proto-modernistic rhetoric and the way he elevated the rather sensationalist genre of opera from entertainment for the masses, I know it's hard to believe, but that's what it was for most of its history, to a high art form of almost religious dimensions, an all-embracing utopianist vision of theater as a multisensorial and perfectly unified synthesis of the arts. Over Christmas break, I was reminded just how far-reaching Wagner's ideas were amongst modernists when I toured a home by the modernist architect Frank Lloyd Wright, who I'm sure you've heard of, who designed not just the home itself, the walls and roof, etc., but also the furnishing, the decor, the tiles, stained glass windows, other details that might have been previously relegated to another craftsman, or the family itself who lived there would collect pre-made, mass-made objects to put in there. Wright wasn't merely designing a house, but the whole experience of living in the space, so that it was all unified. Just as Wagner wasn't merely composing an opera, but the whole multi-sensory experience of a live theatrical event. Of course, Wagner was also co-opted for more nefarious reasons during the 1930s and onward. His anti-Semitic sentiments, his megalomaniacal dictatorialism, and his glorification of the Germanic people and his music dramas made him a favorite with Hitler and the Third Reich. In this course, we will see a somewhat less violent applications of his ideas continue in the realm of opera, but also in ballet, an art form Wagner had little to do with and seldom featured in his music dramas. Granted, Wagner was a larger-than-life personality, and few artists, actually none that I can think of until the second half of the 20th century, could replicate his amazing versatility, his triple threat persona as author, composer, and director, in addition to producer of his music dramas. He even created a whole new opera house and designed how you sit in the opera house, the fact that the lights dim down when the opera started, and that there were no boxes in the theater that separated the wealthy. These modern ideas of theater in general, not just opera, those are all Wagner's ideas. And so, in most cases, the Gesamtkunstwerk won't originate, at least the ones that we look at in this course, won't originate from the mind of a single super artist, but will be divided amongst several hands. What matters is less that a theatrical work emerges from a single person, which it rarely does, every single component, but that all the creators are unified in their artistic vision. Even when the collaborators aren't working together simultaneously, for example, when a composer is setting to music the text of a play that already exists, or when a dancer is choreographing a ballet to an existing orchestral piece, there's still a greater desire amongst modernist artists to stay true to the themes and mood of these pre-existing works that inspired their creative response in their unique medium. I should add, however, that Wagner retracted some of his ideas in later works, and being a composer, he unsurprisingly restored music to a privileged position, although only slightly more privileged. He still, of course, gave ample weight to the other components of theater. And this course, excuse me, and this course will follow that late Wagnerian tip in the Gesamtkunstwerk scales by favoring the musical component of ballets, operas, and musicals that we'll be looking at. I am a musicologist, and my specialty is music. By musicology, I mean this is a field you may not be familiar with, and musicology refuses to study a musical score as some isolated sonic object. Musicology is what art history is to the visual arts, the study of music in its historical, biographical, and cultural context. So you can expect the bulk of this course to deal with music itself, how the score of a ballet is put together, how the score of an opera breaks with tradition, how the score of a musical might borrow from popular styles. But true to the spirit of the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, these considerations will always be placed in dialogue with the work's other constituent elements. We will certainly see musical parallels with other art forms, how a literary technique from an opera's symbolist text or the visual technique from a ballet's cubist costume design might translate into an analogous compositional technique. But we've also got to remember that music is a very vague and abstract medium that deals in sound. It deals in melody, in harmony, rhythm, and timbre, the sound quality, whether the sound of the violin versus the sound of a flute. And that music can't express ideas with the same semantic specificity as text or painting. Dance is also not so good at expressing certain ideas, but it's better than music at expressing, at conveying meaning. More often than not, music depends on design, choreography, or text to tell the story. It can certainly interact with these elements, especially the latter two with choreography and text, which they're wed together so closely when you set a voice to music that's singing a text, or when a dancer is so rhythmically connected to the music. But without those elements, music is unable to convey complicated ideas or plots. Of course, there's pieces of music that have a secret plot, or maybe not so secret, that it's trying to convey some idea, but that's usually depends on the program notes. You open up and it says, this is the story of XYZ, that you wouldn't have known that just from listening to the symphonic work. Music speaks a strange language that isn't suited to description, to storytelling, or to depiction. But this language can do things that the other art forms can't. Notably, it can access the ineffable realm of human experience that we saw modern artists trying to convey, perhaps less successfully, in the medium of painting. Energy, emotion, movement, psychological states, moods, atmospheres, spirituality, bodily sensations, dreams, levels of consciousness, these intangible or inexpressible ideas of life are the realm of music, and granted its unique and rather mysterious position among the arts. So to close, I'd like to read a quote from Wagner himself, which nicely sums up this idea and his ideas, but also this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk and the collaborative spirit of these works that we'll be looking at, which will inform our final project. You can read more about it in the syllabus, and which you'll get a more detailed description of later this week or next week. So here's this quote from Wagner to close our discussion today. At the precise point where one of these arts reached limits beyond which it could not go, there began at once with rigorous precision the sphere of action of the other art form, that is. That, consequently, by the intimate union of these two arts, it would be possible to express with wholly satisfying clarity what each of them could not express separately. So with that, we will close today's lecture. I am so looking forward to working with you guys, and especially and hopefully seeing you in person. It's not fun doing it this way. Sorry. I hope I made it fun, but it's not. It's tiring recording these. So I hope I can put some energy in these and make them enjoyable. These first 3 video lectures. Next week we will be working on. We will be looking at what is often argued as the first work of modernist music. The work Prélude à l'après-midi d'enfant, the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. The music by Claude Debussy, and eventually turned into a ballet by Nijinsky, the famous dancer. It's a very short work, so you should definitely listen to it multiple times. There is an MP3 of it available that you can download, and then there's a couple of videos on approved videos that I've put on our site. Many of the videos online are counterfeits. We'll learn about why they're counterfeits next week, or maybe hopefully we'll get there. The choreography is fake choreography. Oh, how does that mean, Joe? I don't know. We'll find out. Yep, so enjoy that. It is a gorgeous work, mysterious work, a strange work, an erotic work. It's brimming with sexuality, which will be one of the topics of our lecture next week. So till then, ta-ta.